Cato Institute.
Cato Institute.
Cato Institute.
The Cato Institute.
Joining me now is John Mueller. He's a professor of political science at Ohio State University, a fellow at the Cato Institute, and author of Chasing Ghosts, the Policing of Terrorism. Professor, I thought of you yesterday. I read the Friday New York Times. There was a front page story with this headline, "Fear in the Air. Americans look over their shoulders." Should we not be looking over our shoulders?
What's really important is to get the fears in context and not fear things that are of relatively little probability. And what seems to be the case is that your chance of being killed by a terrorist is about 1 in 4 million per year if you're in the United States.
My biggest concern, honestly, is that those troops are just the first iteration of continuing additional U.S. presence in Syria. This is a classic example of what we call mission creep. Those troops, even if they are successful in their limited mission, can only pave the way for more troops, and that can only be bad for everyone involved.
We need to tell these states that we're not just going to fill the gap if you won't do it. These states are far more vulnerable to ISIS than we are. They have a much bigger stake in the game, but every time we step up and offer some sort of U.S. military support, they don't have an incentive to do it themselves.
This is already distracting attention somewhat from the ISIS attacks last week in Paris and the attack in Mali by apparently an Al-Qaeda affiliate. You know, all along the concern of actual fighting between U.S. and Russian or Russian and U.S. allies, that was always, in my mind, a greater concern, and lo and behold, that's what we're talking about today.
The boomers were big, and they've taken up all the heat and light in American society and politics for quite a while. Gen X, which came after the baby boomers, was a much smaller generation, and the millennial generation, however, born roughly in 1980 and onward, is huge. And so they're already a quarter or a little more of the population, depending on how we measure it. And they have distinct sets of views on foreign policy and many other things.
When millennials voted for President Obama, it meant different things to different people. Millennials are overwhelmingly socially liberal. And for many of them, their vote for Obama was actually not a vote for free stuff. It was actually a vote for the culture and the style of what he presented would be as part of his presidency.
What concerns me most is how much this feels similar to 2003, 2004, when we had a Republican president, Alan Greenspan was at the Fed. We came off the dot-com bubble, 9/11, and the concern was about jobs and about the weakness of the economy. And to me, we waited too long then with very low rates, and what we got out of it was a very nasty housing bubble. And of course, you could say the similar liquidity that was provided in the late 90s that drove up the dot-com, that contributed to the dot-com bubble as well. So, my primary concern here is, we've lived through a financial crisis. It's been very, very painful. I don't want to repeat it. And I don't really care who's the president. I don't care about blaming which president's which because, they've all done a pretty bad job, in my opinion.
Both Evans and Dudley expressed caution due to concerns over inflation running below the Fed's 2% target. But St. Louis Fed President Jim Bullard says that both the Fed's inflation and employment goals have already been reached.
The policy rate remains near zero, and the Fed's balance sheet is more than $3.5 trillion larger than it was before the crisis. Prudence alone suggests that since the goals of policy have been met, we should be edging the policy rate and the balance sheet back to more normal settings.
As long as the Fed is focused on, as Jared said, inflation, economic growth, the employment picture, whether the labor market's tight or not. I'm expecting the economy to be a little bit lackluster. The labor market is not nearly as tight as the employment rate would suggest because we've had such a dramatic fall off in the labor force participation rate. So I'm not expecting interest rates to get away from us.
You have an adjustable rate mortgage. Would you be concerned enough to move into a fixed rate mortgage?
I probably would, not because I think rates are necessarily going to get away from the consumer, but fixed-rate mortgages are at very attractive levels. I mean, except for kind of late 2012, early 2013, it's the best rates we've ever seen. So, hitting that is pretty attractive, I think.
The editors called Trump a menace who would take the work of generations and trample it underfoot in behalf of a populism as heedless and crude as the Donald himself.
A charlatan, unmoored, and crazy. A man of tantrums and homicidal fantasies.
Influential conservative magazine The National Review goes live online with its Against Trump issue, a scathing editorial accompanied by 22 articles from these leading thinkers bashing the billionaire. David Bose wrote one of the editorials.
He is a philosophically unmoored
political opportunist with tendencies toward strongman ideas.
Trump is not seen as a conventional candidate who will have a very effective get-out-the-vote effort, a ground game, but he's got such a lead. Republicans don't sound like the party of limited government very much. No one's talking about cutting spending, reforming entitlements, etc. Democrats are not talking about some of the issues we would expect them to stand up on, protecting civil liberties or being a little bit skeptical about the use of American power overseas, because I think some of the populist bluster has crowded out traditional positions that we'd like to hear the parties talking about.
Yeah, that's a good point.
The main part of the TPP is the free trade part. It's the reduction of tariffs and quotas, the elimination of protectionism. And I think that the value of the TPP is that there are lots of protectionist policies in place in the region. And to the extent that the TPP eliminates those policies and reduces that protectionism, you will see economic growth and development, increased consumer choice, and increased quality of life.
The political rhetoric likes to underscore this view that all foreign investment is outflows from the United States, and it's a U.S. factory being taken down, bolt by bolt, rafter by rafter, and being reassembled somewhere else. That is really accounts for a tiny share of outward investment from the U.S. We have a lot of companies investing in the United States and employing Americans. About 6 million Americans work for foreign headquartered companies, and they're adding on average, they add more value, they produce more exports, they consume more imports, they pay higher wages. So we should embrace this form of globalization. Is actually good for the U.S. economy.
I think the big picture here is that all the Republican candidates have very much pro-growth supply-side plans, which is remarkable. The thing we have to remember is if one of these guys or gals wins in 2017, it will be Paul Ryan, the head of the House Tax Writing Committee, who really writes the big tax reform plan. He's as gung-ho as all these Republican candidates. So, the general direction of reform here is lower rates, and ultimately it will be Congress that writes the actual tax plan. So that's the big picture here. The differences between the plans, I don't think they're that important. They all, for example, have large business tax cuts, which I think is the single biggest thing we can do for the U.S. economy in coming years.
I have a hope for 2017 that whatever happens in the election...
2016.
Yes, because things will get a little bit worse in 2016, talking about government policy. But maybe, just maybe, something will happen in 2017 to get a hold of this entitlement state that's like a cancer on our country. If we don't do it, this is why I'm hopeful, because the consequences if we don't do it, this may be our last chance. Because if we get too far down the road with the pig of the baby boom going through the python, we may have lost our last chance to actually save the country from long-term fiscal chaos.
Under current projections from the Congressional Budget Office, not from some right-wing conspiracy like nutcase, show that if we keep spending current rates on Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, even with a healthy amount of tax revenue consistent with historical averages, we are Greece. We are bankrupt. We can't even remotely pay for what we're planning to spend.
On both sides, the confirmation fight already is a rallying cry for their base.
We are in uncharted waters, especially given the modern current polarization of the country and of Congress versus the White House.
Since 2000 onward, the U.S. has let in about 860,000 refugees from around the world. Now, since that time period, only 3 of those people admitted have been convicted of a terrorism-related charge. That's about 1 for every 286,000 refugees are convicted. Now, to put that in perspective, in 2014, 1 out of every 22,000 Americans committed murder. To put that in perspective about how safe this group of people really is. I mean, you have a 21-point checklist for these Syrian refugees. It takes 3 years for them to go through it. The first check is by the United Nations, which rejects 99% of them. And then they start the process of dealing with the United States. Comprehensive interviews, comprehensive checks. And I think the data is pretty clear. It speaks for itself that the refugee system is very, very safe.
Experts say announcing the plan now, over the Christmas holiday, is meant to maximize attention, especially in Central America.
The government is sending a political message to Americans that they will enforce
enforce immigration law, and to Central Americans that if they try to come here illegally, the government will send them back.
I really do hate it with this immigration stuff. I mean, O'Rourke, was that a tribe in the Dakotas somewhere? I don't think so. You know, we are a nation of immigrants. What's keeping us ahead of the Europeans and other economies is our welcoming of immigrants. That's what keeps our age down. You know, I mean, everybody's got to support me soon.